The end of the American Civil War in 1865 effectively meant the end of slavery, but African Americans were in for a long struggle before they were finally awarded equal rights. As of 1870, all eligible male citizens were able to vote. However, blacks were discouraged too by violence and eventually legal stipulations. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled to maintain racial segregation in private businesses in a case called Plessy v. Ferguson. This soon broadened to include schools, and many southern states applied this separate but equal mentality to all aspects of life. However, this led to the application of Jim Crow laws, which resulted in blacks being treated as second-class citizens. Segregated schools, public transit, restrooms, water fountains, and more continued well into the 1900s. In 1909, a group of prominent black and white campaigners created the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. Their goal was to increase racial equality and challenge issues like the Jim Crow laws. Unfortunately, it was between 1910 and 1930 that white supremacist group the Ku Klux Klan saw its biggest expansion amid increased racial friction. Following the First World War, the NAACP was devoted to ending lynching by white vigilantes.
He that gets hurt will be he who has stalled the battle outside.
By mid-century, the group became instrumental in the Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka court case. This class action suit, filed in 1951, asked that segregation in schools be struck down. Taken to the Supreme Court, the case resulted in the first integrated school in the United States to open in the fall of 1955. Encouraged by the decision, the civil rights movement began to hold high-profile boycotts, marches, sit-ins, and other peaceful protests.
Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out.
These included the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott in support of Rosa Parks. Parks, a middle-aged seamstress, boarded a bus to take her home. Several stops later, the bus driver requested that she give up her seat to a white passenger. This was the law in Montgomery at the time. Parks refused to move and was arrested as a result. Her actions set in motion a series of acts of defiance that grew in intensity over the next 10 to 15 years. Parks was seen as the mother of civil rights movement and continued to be a big part gaining equality for everyone up to her death in 2005. Another watershed moment came in 1957 when a high school in Arkansas admitted a group of African American students nicknamed the Little Rock Nine. Protested by fellow students, the governor, and even the state's National Guard, President Dwight Eisenhower eventually intervened to ensure the students' safe passage. By 1962, universities also began integrating, though black students were still met with protests and violence. The Southern Freedom Movement continued into the 1960s with support from newly elected President John F. Kennedy and his brother, the Attorney General Robert Kennedy. The violence of the Birmingham, Alabama campaign influenced the president to fully endorse the movement. On June 19, 1963, he proposed the Civil Rights Bill to Congress, which was approved in 1964 after his death with support from President Lyndon Johnson. The bill struck down existing legislation that allowed for discrimination, and its approval was largely influenced by Martin Luther King Jr. Born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, King is seen as being the most influential figure in the civil rights movement. The March on Washington of August 1963 captured the attention of the media and the population. This event attracted hundreds of thousands of people in support of civil rights. This is where King made his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which is still widely renowned as one of the greatest speeches of all time. Following the Civil Rights Bill being passed in 1964, the Voting Rights Act was passed shortly after in 1965, ending the prejudice voting system. Instantly effective, blacks began voting and running for public office. However, just days later on August 11th, a violent six-day riot in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts resulted in 34 deaths. This was indicative of a period of racially motivated violence that occurred in the mid to late 1960s. This era also saw the rise of Black Power, led in large part by Stokely Carmichael in opposition to extremists like the Ku Klux Klan. This ideology was exemplified by the Black Panther Party, which followed the principles set forth by Malcolm X. Born Malcolm Little, he changed his last name to X to signify his rejection of his slave name. Charismatic and eloquent, Malcolm became an influential leader of the Nation of Islam, which combined Islam with black nationalism and sought to encourage and enfranchise disadvantaged young blacks searching for confidence in segregated America. Rising to prominence in the 1950s, his radical ideas advocated militancy for blacks. He challenged the mainstream civil rights movement and the non-violent pursuit of integration championed by Martin Luther King Jr. He urged followers to defend themselves against white aggression by any means necessary. After his assassination in 1965, his best-selling book, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, popularized his ideas, particularly among black youth, and laid the foundation for the Black Power movement of the late 1960s and 1970s. Despite racial tensions continuing to the current day, the civil rights movement laid the groundwork for racial equality as we know it. It served as a model for the support and advancement of other minority groups such as women, disabled, homosexuals, and many others. The election of President Barack Obama in 2008 is seen by many to be a culmination of centuries of work in favor of racial equality. This is something nobody would ever have dreamed could have happened just 60 years ago.
If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone, or the times they are a-changin'.